I went into ministry because I really felt called into ministry.
To me, it's a tremendous privilege to be a Buddhist priest.
Very few places in world or culture do you have an opportunity to impact people's lives at the level that you do.
That it is to be a compassionate presence.
The ability to help people, but to help them make meaning in their lives.
I think preachers are seen as the person that, in a sense, goes to the mountain like the prophet, receives the word of God, and explains to people what it says.
Nurturing people to have ownership of the texts and the traditions.
In all those holy moments of life, birth and celebration and pain and death.
My overall goal as a rabbi is really to be a teacher.
We come together in a congregation in order to be nurtured and taught and challenged so that we can go out into the wider world and do the work that needs to be done.
We need to understand the precious nature, of that sacred space as guardians and as their protectors, that we are to do no harm, and that it's not about our ego. It's not about meeting our needs.
I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. And as grace is your middle name, I pray that you will discover the grace of God. Last line, here we go!
To serve in the role of spiritual leader is a sacred gift. When we devalue that gift by exploiting or abusing our congregants, the harm we cause is far greater than even the worst headlines might proclaim.
Somehow the experience is that God has abandoned me, that God is somehow abusive.
There are preconceived notions about ministers anyway. Those notions perhaps suggesting the lack of integrity, the idea that they're charlatans, that they don't really practice what they preach. And when something like this occurs, it just reinforces that idea.
It was very hard for the church. There was a group of parishioners who really liked him. He's an excellent preacher, and really responded to his sermons in particular. There was another group that was so offended by what had happened and felt so betrayed by it that they were very angry. There was a large group that didn't know what they thought.
This is not just a betrayal of trust between the pastor and the congregant, it's a betrayal of trust for the whole congregation.
They may not come back to church of any kind for a long time, if they come back at all.
There's enough pain in people's lives, we should not be creating more. And once you've seen the disruption in a congregation or a sangha that's caused by clergy crossing boundaries, you would never want to go there again.
As clergy and spiritual teachers, of course we don't want to cause harm to our congregants and students. But often we are not prepared for the complexity of our role as spiritual guides.
Go in peace.
We may not understand how it's possible for hurt and pain to come out of our well-meaning intentions. This confusion is often experienced around issues of professional boundaries.
Are you sure this is what the church board meant when they talked about setting boundaries?
I think boundaries are a gift. I think that boundaries are the things that give shape to our relationships, all of our relationships. And there are different boundaries that are appropriate in different kinds of relationships.
Now, one of the difficulties in ministry is that we misunderstand boundary setting with not being nice. A lot of people believe that boundary setting is a rude experience. Through my filters, I believe that boundary setting is an act of grace.
Is that we tend to think of boundaries sometimes as though we're quantum physicists. We tend to think of them in terms of physical realities, and there is a physical reality there. But the best description I've ever heard of boundaries within the interpersonal description is given by Dr. Nancy Cole. She says that boundaries simply refer to the sanctity of the self in relationship.
Boundaries make it safe.
in relationships, they let me know who I am versus who you are, and how to keep being me without merging into you. So that boundaries became a very healthy thing. And they kept me from getting overwhelmed by other people's stories as well.
The flow of the energy here is to be in service of the spiritual and personal needs of the person that we are somehow attending to or being present to. So I think we get uncomfortable with boundaries because it is a language, ministry is a language of intimacy.
It's also about knowing who I am, what my role is, and how to use it correctly, and how to stay in my role so that I keep being the rabbi and I don't slip into other places that I'm not meant to be.
We are in people's homes, and therapists, spiritual directors, doctors, and attorneys are rarely in people's homes. Praying with them, sitting with them, maybe having coffee with them. That's a level of trust and acceptance that a therapist would very unlikely have with somebody. Because of that, I think it's harder to see the boundaries.
The fundamental question we have to ask ourselves at whatever point that we may be relaxing boundaries or wanting to relax boundaries in a particular setting is, am I doing this at the expense of the congregant? Is it in their interest that we do this? And what about the impact on the congregation and on the mission that we share?
I got two basic messages in my formation in the seminary. And the first one was, don't be close. Don't be close, obviously physically, but emotionally or psychically either. And that was, I suppose, primarily because that was to protect your celibacy and your way of life as a celibate person. The second message was, however, don't be close was the first one. The second was, but always be available to the needs of people. And I took both of those messages very seriously and I think internalized them at a level that I wasn't even aware of. And I wasn't aware until now, looking back, of how much what I would call psychic whiplash there is in those two messages.
I mean, many times ministers go into the helping professions because they like helping people. I mean, that's part of their personality. That's part of their makeup. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with getting satisfaction out of serving. It becomes imbalanced when people move in this space of they need to be needed, so they seek out vulnerable people so that they could be worshipped, so that they can be, so that people can be grateful to them.
When we lose sight of meeting our personal needs and begin to try to meet those needs, particularly in our working setting or our setting of ministry, then it becomes the focus of our interactions with the people we're there to serve. So then we start expecting them to take care of us and to deal with our personal problems, and it's the place that we unload ourselves and so forth and so on. And then things get very confused because people want to be helpful and they do care about us and so forth. But all of a sudden it starts to feel like that the roles have reversed, and that's where those boundaries are crossed.
I think we all walk a fine line between being vulnerable enough to say, I too have doubted God's presence or whatever, which gives permission for parishioners to say, oh, I guess I can be all right too. To be vulnerable in that way, and yet not to do so much vulnerability that you make the congregation feel like they need to take care of you. And I think when pastors expect a congregation to take care of them, then they're in trouble.
Doors are constantly knocked upon in the pastor's office, so to speak. The doors of body, the doors of sex, the door of mind, the door of spirit. And it's up to the clergy person to understand that he or she doesn't need to go in to every single door that's opened.
And if you're in a small church, in a small town, everybody knows everything about you, just like all residents of small towns. So there's not a lot of secrecy in terms of your private life, but in terms of your inner thoughts, what you wrestle with, what you celebrate, who you are interiorly, there's not as much of that shared with people in the congregation, but they may share everything with you. And when they do, when they reach that level of trust, of telling you their deepest secrets, then you have a really sacred trust to hold that.
This whole discussion of boundaries, some people interpret as that there are boundaries and we should just never cross boundaries, and that's the rule, the new regulation, that we shouldn't cross boundaries. You call someone up on the phone, you're crossing a boundary. But it's a very appropriate boundary under certain circumstances to cross. So it's not about either we cross or we don't cross boundaries, but it's we know what boundaries we can cross and when it's in the best interest of the other person to do so.
We often approach the issues of boundaries primarily as related to sexual issues, but there's another moral and ethical boundary here, and that's the boundary of fundamental respect, of the dignity of the other person in terms of power issues, and that my role as a minister is to respect, to care for, to nourish, and to support that other person in their needs and in their dignity. That includes certainly and obviously the bottom line of not crossing sexual boundaries, but it's much more than that and more profound than that.
In recent years, most clergy and spiritual teachers have come to understand the basic boundary principle that sex between a clergy person and a congregant is unethical. But many clergy may not fully understand the relational dynamic that defines this and other behaviors as a violation of a sacred trust.
Unless you abuse it once in a while, it doesn't really feel like power.
The concept of power is not a negative word. It's like fire. You could either use it to cook a meal or burn a house down. And so the same sense is power, because power is just simply influence and the ability to influence others. And very definitely, ministers have power.
The women and men who go into this do it out of a sense of wanting to serve. Now, realistically, there's also a self-interest. I mean, there's a great sense of fulfillment that we also attain and experience from this. But the illusion is that since I'm a servant, I don't think of myself as having power.
Just by the nature of your role and the nature of what you do and what you know, that in and of itself gives you a position of power. Now, it's how you use it and how you view yourself, in that position of power that makes all of the difference. Because if you have the model of power with instead of power over, then you see yourself as being accountable to that community that has consented to your being in a position of leadership.
Some people just don't get it. I mean, they just don't understand power issues. They don't understand that they have the ability to hurt people.
Your moods can affect people. Your expectations, whether spoken or unspoken, can affect people. You're going to someone and saying, I want to ask a special favor of you. It's not like asking a friend who has mutuality in the same level.
So I think historically, the church has been one place where black men have been given the authority to lead.
Ordained minister is looked upon as the authority. And I call it the pastor is king.
Pacific Islander communities, we look up to our pastors as you said earlier, like representatives of God.
People look at someone in a role of minister with trust. They think we have knowledge, that we have information, that we have experience and skills, which we should have.
Sometimes they make an even greater assumption, which is that you are perfect, that you have become perfect, or in our terminology, enlightened, completely enlightened.
Our job is to figure out how we can bring those gifts to people in ways that don't exploit their vulnerabilities.
I think that we don't really understand the nature of the power that we have in the lives of people that are congregants. I think we often feel powerless, in fact, as clergy persons. In fact, some cases we may feel vulnerable in relationship to the people that come to us.
Being powerful or having power is not about feelings. It's about resources, and either we have resources or we don't have resources. But what they're reflecting, I think, is very real, and it has to do with not feeling in control. And that's a very real feeling in ministry, for better or for worse.
There are places where I have more power and less power. One would be contracts and salaries, and people are deciding what I'm going to get, so they have power over me in that situation. We make board decisions. I really do believe that the lay people own the congregation, not me.
And it was very hierarchical in nature. It was very much a power over a person rather than power with. The rest of the congregation owed their allegiance and loyalty to this person, and that essentially whatever they said was the law.
For many of us, when we went into ministry, we did so because we wanted to change the way in which ministry had been done and the ways we had experienced ministry. And we thought it was about power over other people being misused and so forth. And so the answer to that was to not have that power, and to basically say, you know, we're all in this together and we're all equals and so forth. And I think that was naive. I think that it denies the reality of the role, which is a role where we can bring a positive resource, a positive use of power. But if we're coming from a place of, you know, I don't want to have power, that we have anyway. We really don't have a choice about that. It comes with the territory.
Well, you can be with the people and still have power. You are different. I can do things with my congregation, and we can do them sort of mutually, but I'm still set apart. That's what ordination's about. It does set somebody apart to lead, and not to acknowledge that is, I think, is very dishonest.
I think it's true that women don't necessarily have the same amount of power as male clergy, especially if they are in an assistant position, especially if they're younger. But all clergy inherently have power. And as soon as we start pretending that we don't have any power, we get into trouble. In the right places at the right times, I have plenty of power. I have been in counseling relationships where this person I'm counseling may be older than me, may be more wealthy than I, all sorts of ways in society that person has more power. But in the counseling relationship, I'm the powerful one. And I know that because they've opened themselves up to me and become vulnerable, and I can help them or hurt them.
As clergy and spiritual teachers, we do have power. But acknowledging ownership of that power does not mean we are exempt from other forces which may be beyond our control.
Any interaction we have with someone is risky. That's why we need to know what we're doing and be thoughtful and careful in the way in which we go about it and sort of the circumstance that we create. A colleague of mine once was called by a congregant to come to visit him at home, and she went. And when she got there, he sexually assaulted her. He was bigger than she was. He was stronger than she was. I mean, it was just, there was no question of kind of boundary crossing. We're talking about criminal assault. So yeah, those kinds of things can happen for the person in the ministerial role. But by and large, under normal circumstances, we're the ones that are in the position to be clear about what the limits of those boundaries are.
Spirituality and religion speaks to the deepest and most profound values of our lives, and it also speaks to the most intimate experiences. You know, God, sex and death, relationships, being born and dying. There's nothing that's closer to the core of our being. If I would go to a psychotherapist, or if I'd go to a doctor, or if I go to a nurse and deal with some of those areas, that's a very vulnerable experience. But there's even something more vulnerable about this because it has to do with our ultimate vulnerability to the holy.
The best example we have of a powerful person in the scripture is Moses. And while Moses got angry, and Moses at different points in the narrative, you know, castigates the people, talks to God about hating these people, these stiff-necked people, Moses is never allowed to take his anger out on the people. That's not his job. He can't take advantage of the situation of power. He gets his power because God gives him that power. And only God is responsible for the people beyond that. That's an image that's important to me. I don't have the power I have in a congregation because I'm so good or I'm so talented. I have it because it's a gift that comes to me from God, and then it's a responsibility I have towards the people and towards God.